there. And now we're going to have a new system of rationing, I hear.
Yep, that's right. I'm going to start point rationing pretty soon, they tell me.
Why on earth do they have to do that? We have a perfectly simple system for sugar and coffee. I can't make heads or tails of it. I wish someone would explain to me just why we're going from one thing to another.
How many of us have overheard just that sort of conversation during the past few days since the announcement by Secretary of Agriculture Wickard that canned, dried, and frozen fruits and vegetables were to be rationed within a short time? Well, we have someone here who's prepared to answer some of questions that have arisen and explain what these new developments are all about. Mr. Paul M. O'Leary, Deputy Administrator in charge of rationing in the Office of Price Administration.
Good evening.
Mr. O'Leary, I think you're the right man to answer the questions that seem to be bothering Mrs. Hendricks and her grocer. They're here right now.
I'll be glad to try. Tell me, Mrs. Hendricks, why did you particularly want canned tomatoes rather than some fresh vegetable?
Well, Mr. O'Leary, it's so hard to plan my husband's meals. He very often works overtime and doesn't get home to dinner at all. I like to have a canned vegetable on hand. Fresh vegetables do spoil, and I don't know just when I will have time to use them.
That partly answers one of your questions about the why of this canned food rationing, doesn't it, Mrs. Hendricks? The Army has to plan meals for over 1 million American soldiers scattered over all the earth, and they have to be fed canned foods because only canned foods will be useful for months. You can imagine what fresh tomatoes would look like when they got to North Africa.
Say, that's right, Mrs. Hendricks. I know what spoilage means with fresh fruits and vegetables. Are we feeding soldiers a great amount of canned goods overseas, Mr. O'Leary?
Yes, indeed, we certainly are. For the Army and Navy and our fighting allies as well. They are fighting on our side, and they can do a better job with some good, substantial American food under their belt.
Yeah, Mr. O'Leary, that's going to take an awful lot of canned stuff.
Yes, but we've got a lot. We have been at peak production as far as food is concerned.
Then I still don't see why we need rationing.
Even with that super production of ours, we are still going to have to cut down our consumption of canned food.
Mr. O'Leary, you mean rationing?
That's right. We've got to divide among our civilian population what we have left after feeding our fighting men. And that means there will be a little less for some of us, but a fair share for all of us.
Well, I'm all in favor of seeing that those boys get first chance of whatever there is.
Yeah, Mrs. Hendricks has a son in the Army herself, Mr. O'Leary.
That's fine.
And I know there's a food supply problem wherever my Joe is.
And you, too, are entitled to your fair share. That's what this rationing is going to do. And at the same time, it will prevent the selfish hoarders from grabbing everything in sight. You see, Mrs. Hendricks, not everyone has shown as much patriotism and common sense as you showed when you bought only 1 can of tomatoes. You can imagine what your grocer's shelves would look like if his customers came down on him like a swarm of locusts.
Well, I kind of limit the number of cans of fruits and vegetables I sell right now.
That's a sensible idea. The sort of homemade rationing that has to fill the gap now before regular rationing goes into effect.
I guess some of us storekeepers sort of wonder how come that rationing was announced so long beforehand. That just seems to invite hoarding.
There was no choice about it. We simply had to announce this program in advance. Such a program requires the cooperative understanding of something more than 500,000 retail stores, to say nothing of the wholesalers and the producers. It also requires the training of more than 1 million volunteers to give out the new ration books. That information was bound to lead to all sorts of rumors and misinformation. It is a complicated program at best. It would be out of the question to announce such a program one night, let's say, and put it into effect next morning. No one would understand. No one would know what to do and how to make it work. Everyone, the public, the retailers, and wholesalers, needs a certain amount of time to learn the hows and the whats of this program. That's just why we have taken people into our confidence and are relying on their patriotism and good sense to help make it work.
About this point rationing, Mr. O'Leary, why do we have to have a brand new system to learn all over again? Why can't we have the same coupon system we use for sugar and coffee?
Well, the system we use for sugar rationing wouldn't work out in the case of canned and processed foods, nor for a lot of other commodities we may have to ration later on. You see, sugar was a relatively easy thing to ration. Nearly everybody uses sugar, and most people use about the same amount of it. So all we had to do was to take all the sugar available for civilians and divide it up, giving everyone an equal share. Of course, there are exceptions, mainly people who do home canning, but we take care of them with supplementary rations of sugar. Besides the fact that everybody uses sugar, we must remember that there is no widely used substitute for sugar. Now let's look at the canned foods we are rationing. First of all, canned fruits and vegetables are not one thing. There are a lot of different things, and many of them can easily be substituted for others.
That's right. When I run out of canned peaches, I switch my customers to canned apricots or pears. They don't object much about having to turn to something else, but there's nothing else to turn to when there's no sugar.
Precisely. Because people are accustomed to a wide freedom of choice when buying processed foods, straight rationing would not work at all, and the supply situation would be crippled. For example, if we were to divide up all the canned apricots in the country and give everybody an equal share of canned apricots, whether he wanted them or not, then each person would get less than 1 can of apricots a year.
I can see where that wouldn't be fair. Folks who wanted apricots wouldn't get enough to do them any good at all, and the fruit would be wasted on folks who didn't want apricots.
That's why the point system was invented. Under point rationing, you have freedom of choice when you shop. You can buy anything in stock. The only thing we limit is the amount of ration food you may buy. It is the nearest thing to unrestricted buying that we can have in wartime.
Can you give us an idea of how it will work?
Point rationing will go into effect when you are issued the new ration book, War Ration Book 2. The stamps in that book are marked with an 8, 5, 2, or 1. The different sorts and the different sizes of canned fruits and vegetables will be given different point values. When you go into your store, if a 20-ounce can of corn has a point value of 3, for instance, and an 8-ounce can of apricots a point value of 5, you will detach an 8-point stamp and give it to your grocer. Those values I mentioned are only illustrations, of course. No point values have been set yet for any canned goods.
How are the point values to be set, Mr. O'Leary?
Principally according to the relative scarcity of any particular canned product. Things that are much scarcer than usual will have high point values. Things which are not so scarce will have lower point values.
Will the stamps be for any set period of time, Mr. O'Leary?
Yes.
Well, in that case, I'm sure I should always try to buy the items that have low point value and make my stamps go farther.
You'll be smart if you shop like that. We expect that the point system will work as a kind of balance on the market by making it desirable for shoppers to buy the things which are least scarce. From time to time, point values of some canned items will be changed. They will be set higher if they are selling too fast, or lower if they are selling too slowly.
Well, that sounds pretty sensible to me, Mr. O'Leary. Not that she would, of course, but if Mrs. Hendricks were stocked up in big quantities, instead of doing the sensible buying she does, it would mean some of my other customers wouldn't have anything at all. I know.
I think I ought to point out that hoarding of canned goods is not only unpatriotic, but also completely useless. In the first place, canned goods are going to be rationed so that people won't be seriously short, so they will have a fair share. And in the second place, all canned goods on hand will have to be declared when you get your War Ration Book 2. Coupons will be torn from your book to even up for the excess stocks of canned goods you have on hand at the time.
Well, I don't suppose there'd be many of them, and I'm sure there wouldn't be any among my customers. But how about that chiseling few that's always looking for a chance to pull a fast one? What are we going to do about them if they don't report the canned food they have?
Fortunately, Americans, being the kind of people they are, that isn't an awfully big problem. Most Americans are not cheaters, and most Americans don't like people who are. But for the few who you speak of, we can point out that it's a very serious offense to give false information to their government. It can be serious to the tune of heavy fines and even prison sentences.
That's a good stiff penalty, but it's all right with me. A lot of Americans are making really big sacrifices in this war. I think we've got the right to expect everybody to play fair here at home.
Me too.
Mr. O'Leary, I just thought, there's something I wanted to ask. About that declaration of canned goods on hand, does that include the stuff we put up ourselves?
No. This applies only to commercially packed canned fruits and vegetables.
Well, I'm sure I'll be able to get along on my share, especially since I can make my ration go farther by careful shopping.
I know you can, Mrs. Hendricks, and I don't deny that all of this calls for careful shopping. You want to get good values, naturally, and you want to get canned goods with the lower point values, and still plan a balanced diet for your family. That means thinking about it and planning to an extent many of us have never bothered with before.
I know. People come in here, they run their eyes along the shelves, and they say, I can't think of a thing to have for dinner tonight.
Yes, food for the home is going to take planning, careful planning. There's going to be enough. No one is going to go hungry. There will be enough for our boys and allies abroad, and for us at home, too. This whole point rationing plan is just so much insurance against people going hungry. You know how it was with coffee, and that is something we're really short of. People stood in line for hours, and then often didn't get any at all. Some people have been without coffee for weeks when rationing went into effect. Now people have coffee. Maybe not as much as they might like, but everybody is getting his fair share. Let me repeat, no one need go hungry because the American people, through their government, are planning to win this battle of food, just as our armed forces are making the plans to win those battles which will bring us victory.
This was another of the weekly programs entitled 100 Million Questions, presented by the Columbia Broadcasting System in cooperation with the Office of Price Administration. On the program today was Mr. Paul O'Leary, Deputy Administrator in charge of rationing. Next week, same time over most of these stations, 100 Million Questions. This program originated in the studios of WJSV, Columbia's station for the nation's capital. This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.